I also had some time with Scott before the conference started. Great guy. Thank you, Scott, for having us here. Why are we here today? I have got a very good panel member representing different parts of the product development. Over the past 3 days, we have been discussing about new technologies coming around. We saw all the presentations. So this is one of my observations. Every one of us, when we are inventing something, we try to put an economic argument around it. We want to put a health outcome argument around it. But when do we start doing that? And is it enough? Is it enough from a perspective of getting your traction into the market? Is it enough for your investors, right? From our experience, when I do at Alira Health, when the investment presentation goes around to an investor, they land on our desk asking us whether the economic analysis that you did is what being accepted by the customers. Will that give you the traction? So this panel is all about not looking at from an investment perspective, but rather looking at how do you get traction into the market. When Scott came to me for a panel discussion, and it is all about new companies, investors around, and we brainstormed regarding this topic. Does it make sense? Is it something that people should look at this early stage of their product development? We kind of did a survey, and based on that survey, what we found is around 60% of the technologies has some kind of health economic argument, but what they miss is what does it mean for their customers? What does it mean for a provider? What do it mean for a payer? So an infection reduction of 50% is great, but does that going to move my needle? Does it going to add a value to someone in the provider space? So what we are going to do, let me first introduce my panelists who are with us. Right now they have, some of us are local, some of us gone through a different route to come over here, and they took a lot of pain. We have with me Seth Clancy. He is VP of Global Access at Edwards. Nice to have you, Seth. We have Michael Neidert. He's Business Development of XG Media. And he will give you an idea about from a product design perspective, while Seth will also bring industry expertise into it. I have Dr. Jo Carol Haitit. She is currently the chair of Interregional New Technology at Kaiser Permanente, and in the past she has looked at National Product Council. So happy to have you, Dr. Haitit, over here to give perspective to new innovations. And I have Scott Tackett. He is VP of Global Market Access and Value and Economics at Intuitive Surgical. Really great technology. People always talk highly about how you differentiated bringing that technology into the foray. And everyone, the new technologists out here will be interested in knowing how you do what you do when you bring a technology into the market, right? Through this panel, what we have tried to achieve is having industry represented, having a provider payer network represented from a procurement perspective, and having a product design person over here with his expertise. Mike is gonna let you introduce how early you can think about such economic arguments in the case. Just a bit of housekeeping, how we're gonna do, we are gonna talk about different topics, and at the end of 10 minutes, you guys will have all the opportunities to ask questions to this beautiful panel we have here. To begin, I'm gonna give a bit of opportunity if you can introduce yourself and your intersection of your journey and career with health economics. Seth, why don't you start?
Sure, thank you, Deepak, and it's a pleasure to be here today and with you. As you mentioned, I'm a VP for Global Market Access with Edwards Life Sciences. Those responsibilities include supporting our transcatheter heart valve technologies globally. We have a major focus on the United States and throughout the decade plus that I've been with Edwards. It's really been focused on health economics, outcomes research, and the intersection of evidence with health policy decision making, HTA assessment, and trying to accelerate appropriate access to our therapies for patients.
Mike?
Michael Neidert, I'm the VP of Strategic Development at Zymedica out of the San Francisco office. If you're unfamiliar with Zymedica, we're an end-to-end product development company specializing 100% in medical devices. And that's anywhere from large capital equipment like surgical robots all the way through to consumer wearables, health wearables. And when I say end-to-end, that's anywhere from ideation through to design for manufacturing and actually manufacturing itself. It's interesting when the health economics topic comes up because we're in the business of making our partners successful, obviously, and I think for a long time, we've been in the market of designing for the end user and user-centered design. And I think for a long time, that has always been thinking about the physician as the end user. But when we look at making a device being successful in the market, we encourage all of our clients to also consider the economic stakeholders. And that's more and more these days. I think if you look back 10 years or so, the physician was the primary driver of what devices got used in the hospital. And more now, I think the power has shifted all the way to the hospital administrators. So we encourage our clients, and we work with our client companies to think through how the design of your device is going to impact the economic stakeholders, the hospital administrators, more than anything else. Personally, health economics is, I've had a long history with it. Before Zymedica, I was managing the renal denervation device at Medtronic, and I think that's one of the more interesting health economics devices because you're comparing a $15,000 procedure to a $10 diuretic. But if you look holistically at patient compliance and the long-term ramifications of not being at a blood pressure goal, the health economics story changes a little bit. So happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, I'm Jo Carol Hyatt. I'm trained in general surgery, although it's been a few years since I've been in the operating room doing my own cases. And Kaiser Permanente, many of you in this room, if you're from California, are probably either members or have friends or family who are members. So this is our dominant market in California, more so in Northern California. And we take care of about almost 12.5 million people across the country, have 39 hospitals that we own and operate, California, basically West Coast, California, Oregon, and Hawaii. And in our other regions, we partner locally with hospitals, and our physicians care for our members in those locations. And I've had the privilege of leading our teams that make all the decisions about what we buy to take care of our members, except for the pharmaceuticals, for quite some time. I did that for 15.5 years, and I still lead our tech assessment for KP. We do our own internal evidence reviews, as well as I participate on a number of external sites. And I think for me, the health economics challenge was best articulated by one of my colleagues who was speaking to his orthopedic department members when we were changing implants. And he told them that he wanted the colleagues to think about the choice they made in which implant as if the patient in front of them is their own family member, Uncle Charlie, who might be 30 years old and planning to run marathons, or could be 80 and using a walker, and to think about that choice based on the clinical needs, and the family's going to have to pay the whole bill. And that's, I think, how we look at it. Our decisions are completely physician-led in the choices we make, and we are, the physicians and staff of Kaiser Permanente, our second largest account. So we are actually eating our own cooking and making decisions for ourselves and our family.
Scott Tackett, Vice President of Global Market Access, Value and Economics for Intuitive Surgical. So I oversee approximately 8 different parts of the organization. I oversee our health economics and outcomes research teams, our health technology assessment and evidence management teams, our health policy, payer relations, reimbursement teams, and then a network of global market access teams across the countries and regions around the world. So one of my main jobs is obviously helping to define what is the value that robotic surgery can deliver within the marketplace, and some of our emerging technologies that we have coming out of our business units. So actually, Dr. Joe Carroll and I have been, the Kaiser Permanente and Intuitive have been working strongly together side by side for many, many years, so we'll probably share some of that with you. But I think it's a fascinating time because, for instance, Intuitive, we have more than 22,000 studies that have been written on robotic surgery. So one of my jobs is essentially trying to take the water that is murky and try to make it crystal clear on what is the value in various markets to different stakeholders.
Thank you, Scott. And I will begin the next discussion from you. And since you talked on the topic of making it happen, how does a health economics, when we talk about from a US context, is quite different from others? If you just can give us a light about, since you have a global perspective also, how is it different?
Sure, yeah, and part of my background is I'm actually a practicing health economist and strategist by education and training and so on. So I can give you a perspective from the more academic perspective. I can also give you the perspective of real applied economics. I think one of the challenges that we find is, the market in the U.S. has been changing pretty dramatically over the last 15 years. And so the need for evidence is much more paramount than what it was 15 years ago. When we were living in more of a physician preference item driven market, and Dr. Joe Carroll can speak to that probably pretty intimately, the needs for evidence and the quality of evidence that was required to really compete in the marketplace was not where it is today. And a lot of that has to do with obviously payment reform, but if you compare the needs of the US and where we sit comparatively to other markets around the world, we are a very, very low baseline. Many of the markets are much more formalized on how they look at technology, how they assess it, and then how they actually develop medical policies for coverage and reimbursement around that. So what I will say is that most companies now, instead of thinking about health economics as the afterthought, it's really, really important to get on board and think about health economics early on, not only in design of the product, but also how you're going to enter that product into the marketplace. Because that will drive how you actually, what types of studies you do and how you will do those studies. One thing that I'm a very big believer in is ensuring that your market research that you do on the forefront is helping guide your health economic strategy. Understanding what is the meaningful value transfer of your technology in the marketplace, to who, what stakeholders, and how does it actually get transferred. And then, of course, the hard part is measuring it and actually being able to communicate around it. So, and I think that that's where Dr. Joe Carroll can talk about at Kaiser, how they do that and how they have done a phenomenal job in helping not only their organization understand what is the value of economic return on their technology or their procedures, but also how do you start to transfer that down into the membership base and so on. So,
yeah, Dr. Joe Carroll, Dr. Hyde, when Scott mentions about this as a structural process that you have internally within Kaiser, it's not a matter of couple of years. You have for many years collected that information. How do you do the evidence analysis? Like, what's the structure when you look at an outcome and research? So what basically you look at?
One of the advantages of having a very large, complicated organization is that we have a lot of resources, a lot of expertise across lots of disciplines. For the formal evidence review, technology assessment, we have skilled analytic folks that are able to scan the literature. We've had one of our leaders who's been part of the Cochrane organization I sit on the Blue Cross Blue Shield Medical Advisory Panel. We have close relationships with ECRI and Hayes and other entities. So we collaborate. We don't want to be repeating exactly the same work somebody's already done. So that's the evidence assessment part. But then the decisions, as I said earlier, are really physician-driven. And one of the beautiful things in Kaiser Permanente is our evidence of coverage is really very simple. Other than things that are explicitly excluded, if our physicians feel that the care is medically appropriate, it's covered and we're done. So it's not this long list of things. And that's part of the reason we support our physicians with evidence review and clinical decision support that they can use to make decisions. And with the exception of things that have to be referred outside our organization, our physicians generally are able to practice the care that they were trained to do. And that's a wonderful thing. For the actual deployment of technologies, we are, of course, living in a world where we have a budget and we have to figure out how we're going to spend it and how we prioritize. And we feel that we are the stewards of our members' money. We've already been paid. We're not charging anybody afterward. And so we need to, and the organization, the health plan is not for profit. So anything that is in fact excess at the end of the year, if it's not invested in new facilities or other things, is by policy is required to be returned to our members as a reduction in future premiums. It's how we function. So it's not that we're out there looking for more revenue. And we're looking for things that will provide value, but we'll define value in very different ways than much of the US market. And I know Scott's aware of this. When we made our decision in Southern California to begin our robotic surgical program, it was not about the clinical outcomes from the data publications. Those didn't exist yet. And what we were watching, and I had started tracking this some time ago, was the number of the Da Vinci devices deployed in the training programs across the US and the better urology fellowships and training programs. And I knew that as soon as that number hit about 30% or higher, that we were going to have trouble in the future recruiting and keeping well-trained young urologists, and we need them. So we deployed the program, bought our first robot for our West Los Angeles hospital, not because of any clinical need. It was strictly because of recruiting and retention of our physicians. And every procedure that's been done in Southern California, every new procedure has been under IRB protocol. We've had a lot of publications. We've actually established the value clinically of reduced rectal injuries and strictures with the robotic prostatectomies. And then the first true economic value was presented by our GYN oncologists who were able to do a radical hysterectomy for cancer, which normally would be a several ICU day stay, into an outpatient procedure. The women went home the same day, which was really extraordinary. And that was the beginning of that work.
That's really a good insight because value can be a different aspects, right? So, Mike, coming to you, when you talk about value in a sense of economics, right? So what does, from a product design perspective, health economics or economics means? So is there a structure that you follow when you advise in product development? So how does it work around?
Yeah, it's really on a case-by-case basis, right? And so it depends on what your innovation is, depends on what the product is. I'd echo what Scott said, that I think you should early on have an economic strategy. So just like you've got a marketing and a manufacturing and a product design strategy, you should have some idea of what your economic story is going to be and make sure that all of those elements align, right? And I think it's an interesting point that that economic story might be physician retention, right? And I think it's an excellent point. That's something that you might not always consider. I think traditionally, where we have focused our clients is on the cost side, right? And to a certain extent, I think people always tend to think of that as offering the cheapest device possible, which I think generally is a good strategy. So from a COGS reduction standpoint, you should always be looking at your design for manufacturing from a profitability standpoint, as well as looking at what the market will bear. But I think looking more broadly to how much your device impacts the procedural cost is something that we encourage our clients to look at. If you look at the market research generally, so let me back up. There's kind of two different aspects when we talk about sort of the impact of economics. And one is access of a device, and will we even stock the device? But then two is, will a center actually use that device, or how often will they use that device? And if you look at the market research, I think the top three motivations are still probably safety, efficacy, and ease of use. But right there behind it is economic considerations, right? And when we talk through the economic considerations with our clients, we tend to focus on the procedural cost side of things, right? And so that could be, limit the amount of secondary accessory devices you need, extra guide wires, if there's extra imaging, if you can get away with just fluoroscopy or even not fluoroscopy, limit the number of dedicated operators. If you can design a device so that only one operator needs it and you don't need to have a second person running something else, that's a cost savings. On the other side of things, if you can, on the capital equipment side, if you can limit the footprint or increase the utilization of pumps, coolers, heaters, things that the hospital has in spades, you're looking at reducing the amount of storage space or increasing the utilization of devices. And all of these things, impact the hospital's bottom line. And so, there's, I've probably listed like 8 to 10 factors there, right? And it really just needs to line up with how you're going to approach economics, right? And make sure that your device sort of reinforces what your economic story is going to be.
That's a good way of thinking it quite early in the process. If I can have a working channel inside an endoscope that will make me go certain instruments and have lower amount of instrument exchanges, will save OR time at some point of the process, right?
Deepak, I'd like to expand on Michael's comments real quick. It's a really great point. I think what I would also encourage you guys is look beyond just the surface of operating costs and how your technology impacts the operating costs of an OR or interventional cath lab or whatever it might be. There's really three levels of economics that play out. And if you can imagine an iceberg floating in the water out on the ocean, we see only the tip of it, right? But we know that the vast majority of the mass of that iceberg is below the water. And you have to think about the economics that flow through a hospital system or in the industry. It really hits on three major areas. One is your operating costs. So yes, can you reduce other costs within that operating setting? But the other two major ones that play out that have far greater economic impact are the cost consequences by using one device over other alternative methods. And that has a rippling effect that goes through an organization like Kaiser Permanente or other IDNs or hospitals or so on. The last is opportunity costs. If I can treat a patient with less resources in a smaller period of time, effectively treat them and rapidly discharge them, and if I can then free up another bed, that allows me to treat another patient where I'm receiving revenue, or I'm also keeping from a capital constraint perspective, I don't have to build as many towers of a hospital and so on. If you're in the Kaiser model, it also works the same way. Those are three major economics that carry out. So think beyond just the surface.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that because the part of the title of this is outcomes. And in my mind, outcomes is getting that individual back to full function, back to work, and longer life, healthier life. And those are a much larger overall impact. And that's where I think it really can make a difference. And we talked a little bit earlier about the need for another procedure might be eliminated by something in the design. The example we were talking about had to do with battery life for pacemakers, but reducing the need for additional services and care is really enormous, and the impact of perhaps there's a new allergy medication, asthma medication that could keep a kid in school and not having the parent have to leave work and take the kid to the ER because they need some sort of treatment for an acute asthma attack. There are all sorts of things that change that economic outcome that might actually raise cost of the acute care, but overall have tremendous value.
Yeah, and I think to that point is seeing how that value kind of delivers on the quadruple aim these days.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that train of thought, because I think there's another element of health economics that's important for innovators to keep in mind, and that is being able to educate all of the stakeholders that these HEOR concepts are not static and baked permanently, especially with medical technology that evolves or that is procedure-based. You have to continue to invest and help the provider community become more efficient over time, which has very meaningful downstream consequences from a health economic standpoint. So for example, when you're launching a technology, when we started in the early 2011, 2012 phase with transcatheter heart valves in the United States, we followed a surgical pathway with most of the patients. I mean, the length of stay was 10 plus days. ICU was used, general anesthesia was used. There was a lot of home health ordered. There was some skilled nursing transfers. You fast forward to 2018, 2019, median length of stay in Medicare in the United States for a TAVR procedure is 2 days. And 50% of cases in 2020 are 1 day length of stay. Almost everybody's conscious sedation, awake on the table, getting a valve replaced, and now everyone goes home, or nearly. So in a decade, we've gone from a 10-day length of stay to a 1 or 2 day length of stay. When we get into these health technology appraisals, often reviewers will want to go back to the pivotal trial data that's 10 years old and assume that reflects contemporary practice. One of the things that's really important is to educate around the dynamic nature of how technology is evolving over time, and then to explain and quantify how that translates into economic efficiency. It's throughput, as Scott described, it's reduced total cost to the system, and it's understanding the trajectory of a technology, because it's likely to improve even further going forward. And you want to be mindful of that and be able to explain and articulate how that whole process plays out.
That's the discussion out here is quite interesting from a perspective of what we look at, what the value, what the process will look like. What I would be helpful for all of us to know, because you all have so much of experience dealing with health economics or assessment of it. Any particular case study that comes out of your mind where you have actually applied this on field and has helped you gain the acceptance in the market, or gain the technology more of a credibility as compared to others? Without going into too much of details, if you can share with us a bit of case study from your experience. So what about anything in Edwards or outside Edwards that you have seen?
Sure. So I think two experiences that we've lived through are two national coverage determinations with transcatheter heart valve technology, one starting in 2012, one wrapping up in 2019, one Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee meeting. And so these are big opportunities at the federal level with our largest public payer, Medicare, to evaluate all of the evidence that exists for a particular technology, get into the substantive, clinical, humanistic, and at times economic questions that exist around the technology and its implementation, and how you as industry can respond and arm agencies like Medicare with all of the relevant information that they need to make an informed decision. So the things I think are important are making sure that you're not caught flat-footed and behind when a process like that starts. If any of you have lived through a national coverage determination, it can be abrupt, and there are statutorily defined windows that you have to respond within. So you have typically a couple of 30-day comment periods, and if you are scrambling to put together your synthesis that summarizes all of the relevant literature to demonstrate that the technology is meaningful and necessary, within 30 days, that timeline can escape you fairly quickly. So from a health economics standpoint, it's really important to have the processes, teams, and infrastructure in place. You're not scrambling to do a systematic literature review. You're not scrambling to put together a value dossier that you can submit that's going to be compelling to the authorities. That you have a foundation of that solid evidence understanding that begins the process much quicker for you, right? So in our experience, it was helpful to have ongoing systematic literature reviews, so we had a really solid understanding of the evidence base going into those processes, the ability to quickly synthesize and turn around very detailed and evidence-based comment responses within those prescribed time periods, and the ability to describe all of the evidence base. One peculiar aspect of health economics in the United States is of course, we sort of don't talk about it with our large public players, right? So outside of screening technologies, cost effectiveness, which is the traditional health economics outcomes research tool, not considered in coverage and payment determinations. Now, it's varied with our private payer constituencies, and we certainly have Steve Pearson's ICER organization that's continuing to evaluate different types of health economic data that exists and is published in the United States. But with Medicare, we still make it a point of describing all of the relevant clinical information, the humanistic benefit, which obviously takes into account health-related quality of life, but health status and functional status, which are critical, and the economic consequences. And we try to ensure that that includes broad cost effectiveness information, but also patient preference and therapeutic treatment goals, also procedural efficiency and how that's improving over time, and other opportunities that may exist to even drive more value through the system. So in our experience, having a solid, rooted understanding in the evidence was absolutely essential to being able to engage at a national level with constituencies like Medicare, help educate them, bring resources to bear that educates the groups that are writing the policies, and to be able to do all that in fairly short order.
That's a good insight, Seth, and it also gives us, give the audience over here, people who are developing new technology, to be prepared for such an avenue, right? So
there's a couple of good points I just wanted to pick up on there. I think particularly related around patient preference and thinking holistically. Dr. Hyatt mentioned it as well. Thinking holistically about the patient journey. I mentioned denervation at the top, and that's a case where the economics really only makes sense when you look at what the patient wants, because patient behavior once they leave the hospital has a big impact on the success of that therapy, right? And whether or not they're compliant with a particular therapy is directly tied into their preference. And I think this is a relatively new concept that, I don't know, I know the FDA is starting to consider patient preference in terms of the approval process, and I think it also has ramifications for economics as well.
Oh, that's great. And Mike, since you picked up on the patient preference, from your experience, any case study that you have been involved where you actually looked at, from a health economics outcome perspective, you have a good way of responsibilities prior to joining the product design also. So any case that comes to your mind that you said, yeah, this is where I looked at and this is what made impact in the market access?
Yeah, I think it would be, what I just mentioned there with denervation. I think now in that case, it didn't arrive before the product design. I think it was a little bit cart after the horse, right? But I think it became apparent, that the economic story is intimately related to preference and patient compliance.
Scott, You are also from industry, and Seth gave us a good idea about how it is important to engage with larger payer constituencies or CMS or Medicare. What, according to your experience, has been like working with Intuitive or with other responsibilities ahead? Before that, any case study where you thought, yes, this actually helped me in getting my technology well understood, respected, and accepted in the market?
Yeah, I think that overall, one thing that you have to definitely get a handle on is how you're messaging that value in the marketplaces, and how you're addressing, again, meaningful value transfer. I can't underscore that enough, is that if you're talking about value in the marketplace, what might be valuable to one stakeholder may not be valuable to another stakeholder. And the inherent application of meaningful value transfers means that all stakeholders receive value through your technology. You can't leave any stakeholder outside of that. So obviously it has to have value to the patient. It has to have value to the surgeon or the physician. It has to have value to the provider or the hospital organization. It has to have value to the payer, and it has to have value to the policymakers. So if you're not answering where the value lies across all 5 major stakeholders, then you're going to have a hard time really communicating what is your value transfer in the marketplace. The next thing I would say is that medical technology is vastly different than a pharmaceutical company. Pharmaceutical companies, you prescribe a little blue pill, you look at the drug interactions, and you monitor that patient population over time. MedTech is vastly different. And what we do at Intuitive is we're talking about surgical tools, which is even different because, this is not prescribing a pill. This is using a different surgical tool to accomplish surgery. And what we have found is that investing very deeply in RWE, so real-world evidence through real-world data, has 2 things. Number one is it obviously can help you crystallize what is your value in the marketplace by doing studies with broad populations, large database populations. And the reason why is because you want to look at what is the average impact that this is having. And you want to also develop value messaging off of that. Secondly is, and this maybe is outside the conversation a bit, but the investment of HENOR and large database analysis and large databases themselves is only going to become more robust in the healthcare industry. We are starting a digitalization evolution that will revolutionize the industry overall. And to embed data into MedTech and the ability to drive that data to prompt through artificial intelligence and machine learning how to reduce bad outcomes or so on, we are just at the beginning of that phase. And that's going to be a 20 to 30 to 40 year development phase in the industry overall. We will go through the same phase that the airline industry went through in the 1960s and into the 70s with the development of jet airliners that had fly-by-wire with computer automated systems. So that's what we're heading into. Yep. That cycle will go for many, many decades into the future. But the exciting part about this is that if you invest now and you start to understand your value and you can transfer that into your stakeholders, there is great value to be done. I know with our experience with working with Kaiser Permanente, one of the challenges that you often find with RCTs and MedTech or surgical tools is it's hard to replicate that. And so what we believe very strongly in is don't look to RCTs that are done around the world, is actually look at what the providers and the surgeons are getting as far as outcomes within the 4 walls of their organization. So we've been working with Kaiser Permanente for more than a decade, I believe now, that looks at the value of what robotics means to Kaiser Permanente, not to Sutter Health, not to Providence, but to Kaiser. And that's important, is that you make sure that you can deliver the value and that you can help those organizations truly understand what is the value within the 4 walls of their organization.
That's interesting, Scott. And I knowingly brought Dr. Haidt late into this conversation because we all have at least 1 product, 2 products to talk about, but you on a yearly basis looks like 300, 400 of those technologies, right? You assess them, you give a preference whether to do or not to do, and then the physicians take over. How do you organize that evaluation? So what comes to your mind first when you look at a technology? Because that's a kind of venture, right? It's a kind of venture of evaluation of technology. And you also mentioned that Kaiser has a venture arm through which you also look at different technologies. So if you can help us understand from a case study, what does it means for you as a health economic argument or an outcome argument when you look at the technology at a first glance?
So let me back up. Much of what comes to us is portrayed as new, different, better, breadbox, whatever. But our default position is if the technology came through a 510(k) process with FDA, which means that there were not necessarily substantial trials performed to get FDA approval, we assume that it's the same as what we're already using, and we have no intention of paying extra for it unless there is clear evidence that it's adding value somewhere. So that's the beginning, and if there were PMA studies, then it's likely in the new technology category. So these are for things that are somewhat similar to what we're already doing. There are not that many truly innovative new technologies that come through in any given year. They may be described as such, but they're not. So when we do have something really new, we start with what's published. We often, in the case of true breakthrough, innovative kinds of technology, renal denervation is an interesting example, we are often one of the trial sites, and we were a trial site, although I had to beg Omar for it. We were a trial site for the renal denervation study, the Simplicity trial. And it really did look promising. It seemed like a great idea. Great idea. Didn't pan out, but great idea, at least in the initial. And I understand it's coming back. But if KP has been one of the trial sites, if there's been enthusiasm among our physician community and they're willing to participate in the trials and do all the work that goes with it, then that for us is a huge leap forward in entry into the KP world, because we will then know how it functions in our environment from the trial, and we can very quickly expand on that throughout the organization. So that's one hint. In terms of other pathways, as Deepak mentioned, we do have a venture fund and always looking, and not necessarily all devices. In fact, there have only been a handful of devices recently that have merited investment from the fund. They've been looking at other platforms, most recently, including IT kinds of solutions, some lab testing that has come through the venture fund recently, lab developed testing. So that's one path. And as I said, our physicians are, most physicians are curious people. They are interested in continuous learning. It's required for their license anyway. And they'll have exposure to all of you in conferences that they attend. And if there's interest, they'll bring something into us that way.
Thank you. I just want to be respectful of time. Scott, are we good with the time, or we have? Okay. Perfect. So I want to cover two things in one. From a health economics perspective, what do you think? Is it a continuous process, or is it something has to be thought at certain part of the product development? And more importantly, for audience over here, what's an investment rationale look like? Because when the new companies come out, the innovations come out, they keep their budget aside for a regulatory purpose. They keep their budget aside for product development perspective, design perspective. But they have not thought about how they can go to their investors, tell them that this is the one that I need to look at before I get into the market acceptance. So is it a continuous process? And if yes, what's my reinvestment rationale behind it?
So I do think that it's a continuous process and it evolves over time. But I think that Dr. Hyatt mentions an important factor, which is it really varies by the technology. And so it depends on the level of disruption that a technology represents. It depends on the true nature of the innovation that we're talking about. If there's an established reimbursement pathway with codes that exist, with payment that exists, with coverage that exists, it's an easier barrier to entry in some respects, and the evidence bar is going to be a little bit lower, obviously, unless you're expecting a price premium and an increase in payment or coverage or something to that effect. When it is a truly novel paradigm-shifting technology that changes the practice of medicine in some way, and you don't have an established reimbursement pathway, it is absolutely imperative that you have and invest in a reimbursement strategy from beginning to end. So at the R&D stages of early development, to make sure, again, to Scott's point around describing the value to each of the important stakeholders, that you've checked the box on that front and make sure that your R&D and engineering group is facile in all of the types of value that you're going to need to deliver and communicate to the marketplace. And then as you get closer and closer to the rollout and commercialization, that you have the rigorous and robust evidence that's going to withstand the scrutiny of HTA bodies, of payer organizations that are looking to evaluate whether this represents something that's truly meaningful in terms of the health benefit you're claiming. So you've got to do that. And the extent to which you need to make that investment is sort of predicated on the novelty of the technology in many regards.
Scott, from your experience, like, do you have an investment rationale behind it? They should do it right now when they're in early stage, they should think about it, or is it something that you can procrastinate and go beyond that and leave it at certain other stage of funding, right?
Yeah, I think it's continuous, I will say that. And it's also transformational over time. I think that the studies you do early on within the development of your product might be studies that look at the overall patient journey and what's happening within that patient journey and where your product might address an unmet need. And that will obviously then change. You know, if you start entering into the markets, you're going to want to know descriptive types of analysis, epidemiological types of analysis, and then eventually you're going to do cost-effective analysis. So the variety of the different types of studies that you're going to do are going to change over time. The other thing that you really should take into account is, you know, to do a large database analysis now using the databases that are publicly available across the United States are very affordable comparatively to running some big RCT. So, you know, think small. You don't have to boil the ocean here. We're not talking about an epic event, but think small and do things that make sense and invest wisely. And also look at what you've invested in and how you're solving the problem. If you really don't understand quite yet how your technology affects the patient journey, invest there, because then that allows you to have a message on this point of inflection on how you can change the patient journey and the value it's going to deliver, and then build off of that. So,
Perfect. Dr. Hyde, last word. So you mentioned during our tea earlier, how do you maintain a real world evidence and how do you revisit a certain evidence? So what is this from a provider payer perspective?
So I'm going to actually change that a little bit because I know we're short on time, and make sure that everybody in the room is aware that FDA is trying to help all of you. They have a pre-submission process where FDA will have their experts, and I've attended some of these meetings, and these people are really, really smart, really talented, who want to help. They are really interested in bringing new and innovative products, devices to the U.S. healthcare market, and it's a much easier path from that perspective than it was a few years ago. But as part of that, they have a payer communication task force where any of the companies that are in the pre-submission process, if they're interested, can request to possibly meet with or at least share their device or what they're working on with the various members of that task force. And I'm part of it, Aetna, the Blues, there are a number of other organizations that are part of the task force. And I've attended some of the pre-sub meetings along with the companies to hear the interviews. And the intention is to try and design the trials that will meet both the needs of FDA and the future market in one. So it's a little different than the parallel review, which is another opportunity in working with CMS to try and get CMS codes and coverage decisions at the same time that FDA approval is provided. That was actually attempted with Simplicity for the renal denervation, but then it didn't work. And I just wanted to share that with you because I think it is a really good opportunity.
Thank you. We are shortage of time over here. The panelists are around, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I would just conclude this by saying over here, our intention to bring the industry, the product design, and a provider payer network is to understand from a perspective that the innovations in this room I have watched over the last 3 days are really marvelous. The heart is in the right place. They want to solve a particular problem of the patient. They want to look at how can I make various systems efficient, right? What I wanted all of us to understand over here is having your strategy around a health economics, as Scott mentioned, is you do not need to have an extravagance spending around it, right? But start thinking from a customer perspective, as Dr. Haidt mentioned. What is important? 50% in infection reduction may be important for you as a technology, right? May not be important for Kaiser Permanente. So work with your customers to understand where you are in the very early stage, and with a real world evidence strategy. And as Seth mentioned, if you plan your things properly, it's gonna come across really well. Not to say the least, think it from your product design perspective also, because that's where you start creating value for the entire thing. I want to thank the panelists over here. We did work in the background with a lot of different topics. Thanks for your honesty. Thank you for sharing those ideas with the team. And thank you, Scott, for having us here.
Thank you.